Hey everyone, this is chapter 2 of Christos Memos, Open Marxism, Critical Theory as Militant Enlightenment. Chapter 2 is titled, quote, Marx was not an Orthodox Marxist, end quote. The Critique of Institutional Marxism. So here we go. The development of open Marxism from the initial usage and signification of the term by Kostas Axelos and the French journal Argument, mainly the work of Maximilien Rubel and Daniel Guérin in the 1950s, through open Marxism as it was developed in Eastern Europe, especially in the scholarly work of Karl Kosik in Czechoslovakia, the Polish Open Marxists and the Praxis Group in Yugoslavia, to Johannes Agnoli's work in post-1968 West Germany, and finally to the work developed by Bonafelt, Clark, Gunn, and Holloway within the framework of the Conference of Socialist Economists in Britain since the 1980s, has to be understood as a process of interaction with socio-historical reality and critical exchange and confrontation with the intellectual milieu and theoretical currents both within and outside the broad Marxist tradition. Taking into account the complex history of the open Marxism tradition and the changes to the meaning of open Marxism that occurred over time, it should be noted in line with Schmitt that the, quote, historical process is constitutive for the theoretical process and modifies the theoretical process's categories, end quote. Schmitt. The evolution of the open Marxist tradition came about as the result of a productive dialogue with Lukács, the early Frankfurt School, and critical Marxist theory more generally in the direction of a critical confrontation with traditional theory and positivism. Maintaining a critical strand, which originally manifested as a critique of traditional theory and of the prevailing positivism and scientificism in the Marxist tradition of the Second and Third Internationals, open Marxism has constituted one of the most rigorous and painstaking attempts to critique mechanistic interpretations of Marx and any form of evolutionism, determinism, and naturalized conceptualization of history and society. What? No. I'll try some later. In considering the quote exposition and interpretation, and contextualization, end quote, of the distinctive moments and phases of the unfolding of the open Marxist theoretical current, it should be noted that the contributors differ, and the disparities in the approaches taken should not be overlooked. These differences affect the content of the intellectual trajectory of the authors and their critical endeavor, and also have substantial political consequences. They arguably determine the political choices made, influenced the radicalism of the theoretical undertakings, and exerted a decisive influence on the political itinerary and final outcome of the respective contributions. However, there is a discernible common foundation to the work of these authors, which along with its other shared features contributes to the distinctiveness of open Marxism. The distinctive features that are of paramount importance here are those which have played and could have played a crucial and vital role in the advance of critical theory and radical anti-capitalist praxis. The aim of this study, then, is to reveal and highlight the most radical and revolutionary aspects of their theorizing, the ones that could open new horizons for a critical theory of and against contemporary capitalist society. These characteristic traits have arguably emerged as open Marxism has developed its critical confrontation or rejection of traditional Marxism of social democracy. the state ideology of Leninism, Stalinism, and Soviet Marxism, or over its critical confrontation with other currents of thought, including, among others, structuralism, the regulation school, and analytical Marxism. From this perspective, the open Marxist reinterpretation of Marxist theory implied a fundamental rethinking and subversive critique of global capitalism and its historical transformations. It also amounted to a thoroughgoing critique and profound opposition to institutionalized and codified Soviet Marxism and its orthodox variants. Open Marxist negation of closed and dogmatic forms of Marxism was not just a negative and sterile stance. They went beyond this negation to develop the radical elements of Marxist thought. This development and rereading of Marx included questioning of the methodological uses of Marxist theorizing and investigating how Marx's mode of thinking could be employed and further developed in order to foster and advance the subversive critique of both the existing capitalist order and the Stalinist regimes. Dealing directly with Marx's thought, however, presupposed being able to cope with the first difficulty, that is, how to find a balance between the demonization of Marx in the West on the one hand and his mythification and mystification in the East on the other hand. At the beginning of the Cold War period, but also after the demise of the Soviet regime in 1991, it was difficult to articulate and defend a method to analyze Marx's positions and elaborate Marx's conceptions from a radical left perspective without mystifications and ideological entrenchments. In the various orthodox and institutional Marxist trends, the Marxian theory, through its numerous interpretations, schematizations, and uses, was fetishized, sterilized, and retained as a codified set of, quote, holy canons. In contradistinction to Marx's critical thinking, it became institutionalized and turned into a, quote, scientific Weltanschauung, end quote. The notion of, quote, orthodoxy, end quote, was introduced in the labor movement, and the bourgeois intellectuals and the party cadres undertook the task of safeguarding and interpreting Marx's text and explaining the vague points of dogma. Dissidents and critical voices were demonized as being counter-revolutionaries, and any critical reflection was either abandoned or harshly castigated and ostracized. What has been striking and somewhat tragicomic, however, is that unlike the Church, the dogma of Orthodox Marxism in all its forms was never defined with clarity. The lack of a concrete dogma implied the peculiarity of Marxist orthodoxy. It was, quote, orthodoxy without dogma, end quote, and nobody knew what Marxism really stood for. It was only after the official condemnation of several, quote, Marxist derivations, end quote, or, quote, renegades, that it became clear what Orthodox Marxism was not. Marxist orthodoxy became an elusive concept because it had not been visibly formulated. In other words, it had been transformed into a, quote, unwritten dogma, end quote, papaiouanou. In the 1967, in the innumerable dogmatic disputes, each state ideology, intellectual currency, or political party or group claimed to be the only genuine representative of Orthodox Marxism and maintained that it possessed the whole and absolute truth, which emanated from its own unique and authentic interpretation of Marx's thought. Consequently, they all ended up, quote, invoking Marx and fighting each other for the, quote, genuine ring, end quote, the right to claim the succession of true, quote, Marxism, even though, as Karl Korsch noted, the, quote, real thing, bracket, had, end bracket, been lost, end quote. Furthermore, the theological assumption that perceived Marxian theory as orthodox dogma and claimed the existence of one true and pure Marxism had been proven to be a self-refuting idea, because as soon as more than one orthodox Marxism existed, there could be no orthodoxy at all. Even in periods of dilapidation, theoretical and political degradation and sterility, absolute decay and despair, the various forms of institutional Marxism and the more conservative tendencies of orthodox and dogmatic Marxism within the tradition of the socialist movement retained their own version of Marxism as a closed system, as an ideology in the sense of socially, quote, necessary illusion, end quote. As a result, they upheld their own, quote, eternal values, end quote, which were naturalized, absolutized, and dehistoricized, thus fostering the development of unreflected presuppositions and stereotypical and mythological thinking. Frequently, these dogmatic assumptions gave rise to myths, absolute truths, and semi-religious attitudes. established an institutional Orthodox Marxism function as the ideological justification and official dogma for the ruling class in Soviet-type societies, and served as an ideology and an intransigent doctrinaire set of guidelines for the large number of parties, sects, and minor political groups that claim to represent authentic Marxism. In this context, Marxist thought and critical revolutionary dialectic was reduced to a reformist practice or a party and state ideology and religion, and was used as an ideological justification for the production and reproduction of all those social relations and conditions, quote, in which man is a debased, enslaved, neglected, and contemptible being, end quote. Marx. It served as a flexible tool that justified tacticism, actionism, practicism, and as a means of subordinating theory to politics and activism. Quote, Stalinism, as Stoyanovich, I don't know how to say that name. Let's see. Stoyanovich. That's actually, it's Stoyanovich. It looks like it might be it.
Stoyanovich.
Quote, Stalinism, as Stoyanovich poignantly remarked, quote, converted Marxist thought into the ideology of a new stage of prehistory, unquote. Stoyanovich. From the perspective of so-called scientific and ossified Marxism, Marxian theory was seen as a closed and perfected theoretical system, a harmonious set of doctrines devoid of any contradictions and inconsistencies. Marx's critical theorizing was covered in a sacred aura and identified uncritically with the ideology of various communist parties and their political functions. Marx's, quote, monolithic theory was perceived as a philosophy of history and a system of thought, a unique scientific Weltanschauung, or a socialist political economy. The petrification of Marxist thought was furthered by the fetishization of certain texts, terms, concepts, and passages. This in turn fostered a mechanistic reproduction of eternal values, terms, concepts, and meanings, which are utilized in a doctrinaire fashion and applied uncritically to generate machine-like terminology and perfunctory interpretations of capitalism. This closed system of thought and the recurring reference to an elusive and mythical concept of dialectics was accompanied by other, quote, eternal values, end quote, which solidified into a mystified dogma and engendered a Marxist mythology. Concepts and terms such as, quote, dialectical and historical materialism, end quote, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, the, quote, base superstructure model, end quote, quote, economic laws, end quote, the Leninist vanguard party and the role of the professional revolutionaries were reduced to being constituents of an axiomatic system. Similarly, Marxism's principal meaning became identified and equated with an emphasis on the primary role of the economy and technology, and the idea of socialism grew to be synonymous with industrialization and the unending development of the productive forces. This closed system obtained a canonical force which is evoked to legitimize the political line of the Stalinist government, authoritarian political practices, repressive economic and social policies, and unfortunately and tragically even persecutions, incarcerations, and murders. As soon as Marxism became institutionalized and took shape as a supposed, quote, scientific Weltanschauung, end quote, it also emerged as an established state ideology and a systematized method and doctrine. Within this framework, the dominant ideology received, read, and misused Marxist theory as a means of political propaganda. Marx's work was reduced to a new jargon, the jargon of bureaucratic and technocratic manipulation, which played into the hands of a new ruling class and the authoritarian apparatuses. Marxist thought was reduced to a few technical terms and mechanical expressions and converted into an ahistorical and timeless scheme, an empty formalism devoid of content, let alone radical, communist, emancipatory content. Marx's work was standardized into reified concepts and canonized into a declamatory and high-sounding language. The construction of fetishistic phrases and concepts performed the systematic function of stabilizing and reproducing the Stalinist system of authoritative and exploitative power relations, or the role of the Communist Party and the parties in the West. As Adorno would say, quote, ideology is shifted into language, end quote. Marx's critical theory was misappropriated and distorted as a domesticated, bloodless, and apolitical code of manipulation, which mystified the actual social relations of domination and exploitation. This misappropriation and distortion of Marx's thinking was based on a very selective compilation of his ideas. As a result of this, certain aspects of Marx's writing lent themselves to reinforcing this idolatry and mummification of words and key phrases. Consequently, selected passages of Marx's writings went through a process of purification and idolization, or got neutralized and performed a purely ornamental role in support of specific state policies, while other parts of his theorizing were suppressed, overshadowed, or omitted. Arguably, as in many other cases, this is what happened to Marx's purported method and the, quote, base superstructure model, end quote, which Orthodox Marxism turned into a form of absolute dogma and a standardized scheme. The, quote, base superstructure, end quote, metaphor was established as a, quote, methodological canon, end quote, a, quote, paradigm, end quote, of what supposedly constituted the crux of Marx's method. As early as 1908, Georges Sorel had pointed out that the content and purpose of the 1859, quote, preface was obfuscating and muddling. One of the things that I think is interesting is I think that, like, Georges Sorel, because he had a rightward turn later into like a, I think he had pretty sure he had a rightward turn into like a fascist or like kind of like French nationalist direction. That his like overall his politics. I think he made like interesting and important contributions in early 20th century France to which you would call like Marxist and anarchist or just radical theory. But he's kind of like blanketed as like it's kind of like person who is always a monster, right? Probably in the same way as like someone like, I don't know, Max Shachtman or Karl Kautsky, who had like political developments that people would find unsavory, so they don't like actually like do serious investigation into their work. Anyway, as early as 1908, Georges Sorel had pointed out that the content and purpose of the 1859, quote, preface was obfuscating and muddling. Although in the, quote, Communist Manifesto and his other writings prior to 1859, Marx argued that, quote, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, end quote. In the 1859 preface, there is no mention of the word, quote, class, let alone, quote, class struggle. On this, see Gunn, 1992. Quote, the phrases that describe the role of economics, end quote, as Sorel observed, quote, are extremely obscure, partially symbolic, and consequently very difficult to interpret, end quote, Sorel. Elaborating on Sorel's critical commentary, Prinz examined the historical and political background of Marx's publication in 1859 and opined that Marx's writing was subject to restrictions on the freedom of expression and censorship, as German censors would confiscate, censor, and suppress any text that referred to classes and class struggles. Against this background, Marx used a more technical, neutral, and somewhat suggestive and metaphorical language in order to avoid the danger of censorship and confiscation. Nonetheless, and paradoxically, quote, whereas the book proper found only few readers, end quote, as Prince noted, the 1859, quote, preface, quote, came to be regarded as the, quote, classical formulation, end quote, of the economic interpretation of history and was studied and quoted all over the globe, end quote. Prince, 1969. A mechanical materialism was produced by employing the, quote, base and superstructure, end quote, formula, which is used as a, quote, abstract universal framework, end quote, Kosick, which could equally well be applied to past, present, or future human history, thus contributing to the generation of various economistic and technicist interpretations of Orthodox Marxism. The dogmatic and institutional Marxist currents not only fail to recognize that the, quote, base superstructure, end quote, model is just a, quote, simple popularization, end quote, a, quote, popularization simplification, end quote, Bauhaus, of Marxist theorizing, but they also overemphasized and misused it by popularizing it further in several textbooks and pamphlets. Eventually, as Kosick pointed out, quote, popularization, which had at first appeared as merely rendering the text more accessible, turns out to be a particular interpretation of it, end quote. Kosick. Considered from the point of view of the base and superstructure schema then, social reality was conceived as the totality of autonomous structures that subsisted in and through a mutual interaction and influence. The Orthodox Marxist and structuralist approaches separated and detached economic phenomena from the phenomena of, quote, superstructure, and, quote, that is, political, legal, cultural, or moral phenomena, thus producing and reproducing a particular interpretation of Marxist thought and method, which turned out to be misleading and obscure, and had formidable theoretical and political implications. According to this economistic approach, social and material reality was concerned with and determined primarily by economic phenomena, while all the other social institutions, phenomena, trends, and relations not only played a secondary role, but in many analyses were also considered to be pure ideology. The Orthodox Marxism of both social democracy and Leninism-Stalinism espoused this analytical framework and perspective, which deemed the relationship between the economy and other social phenomena to be unilateral and causal. Thus, the 1859, quote, preface became, as Reichelt noted, the, quote, holy scripture, end quote, of dogmatic and institutional Marxism, which, together with the Stalinist diamat, parenthesis, dialectical materialism, in parenthesis, was considered to be the unequivocal and definitive statement of the Marxist method. In order to overcome this economic reductionism, evolution, functionalism, and determinism, Marx's 1859, quote, preface and the, quote, base superstructure model were read through the prism of mutual interactions between the economy and other social phenomena and levels or structures, or more emphasis was placed on the relative autonomy of the political in an attempt to develop a Marxist political science that complemented Marxist economics. Despite their differences, both Althusser's and Palantzas's structuralist interpretation of Marx's work perceived society as being composed of economic and political structures. These different levels and divisions were construed as reified and natural foundations of a society in which, despite the concept of, quote, overdetermination, or the, quote, specificity and, quote, relative autonomy of the political, end quote, or the autonomy of the different structures and the intricateness of their structural interconnections, and Palantzas's additional role of, quote, class struggle, the economic structure is determinate in the last instance. When more emphasis was placed on the function of certain class practices and struggles, or an attempt was made to underscore and accentuate the role of ideological and political factors, these were restricted by a, quote, objective structure composed of autonomous levels which are fundamentally related to one another within a complex whole, end quote, and whose functions are defined and determined objectively in relation to, quote, the structure as a whole, end quote. Simon Clark. The infamous, quote, base superstructure formula, considered to be the supreme methodological principle of, quote, historical materialism, was formulated by Marx in the 1859, quote, preface, and explained more analytically by Engels, who regarded it as one of the sources for the development of a, quote, materialist conception of history, end quote. The formula was further endorsed and upheld intransigently by the descendant Orthodox Marxist and was this, quote, abstract universal framework, end quote, Kosick, that, quote, Plekhanov schematized so conspicuously, Lenin propagated so passionately, and Stalin definitely canonized, end quote. Petrovich. Its practical application and use as a method of analysis and investigation that succinctly expressed the, quote, material conception of history, end quote, became dominant in the theory, practice, and historical realization of the orthodox variants of Marxism. It was also further elaborated in more sophisticated terminology by the structural Marxist. Why did this part of Marxian theorizing get canonized and instituted? What happened to other ideas and possibilities inherent in Marx's thought, the other readings and uses of his critical thinking? Quote, obviously, as Axelos pointed out, quote, only one of many possibilities gets actualized, probably the one that is most forceful, the one most apt to transmute into, quote, real, end quote, power, end quote. Costas Axelos. What prevailed in the theory and practice of institutional Marxism was the conviction that Marx's theory was identical with a vulgar, quote, economic materialism, end quote, and concerned with the investigation of the relationship between the different, quote, spheres and, quote, structures of social reality, in which economic production had always ultimately been the determining sphere, and that the productive forces were the most powerful and determining factors in the production relations. The view that technology, tools, machinery, or instruments of production are the main components of the productive forces became, quote, real power, end quote, in the service of Stalinist and social democratic political policies and economic practices. In this context, Marx's method was reduced to historical, economic, and dialectical materialism, and Marx's critical theory to an all-inclusive, purportedly scientific proletarian Weltanschauung. See Fetcher. The main objective of orthodox economic and historical materialism was to confirm, validate, and delve into the primacy of the economy in an attempt to investigate, explore, and establish causal interconnections between various spheres of society. This caricature of a materialist conception of history, according to which economics, the economic factor of material production, have always been the only, or, in the quote, last analysis, unquote, the primary factor determining social development and historical evolution, led to the various dogmatic, deterministic, and teleological conceptions of history. The open Marxist tradition's critical confrontation with Orthodox Marxism and Orthodox Marxism's open Marxism's rejection of the base and superstructure economistic schema entailed a, quote, return to Marx, unquote, and an attempt to find a new reading of Marx's critical theory. This return, however, did not mean an uncritical and religious approach to Marx's writings. Open Marxists recognized that the particular positions of both Marx and Engels were partly responsible for the deployment of the positivist and deterministic elements that were manifest in both the theory and practice of Orthodox Marxism. They acknowledged that the institutionalized and structuralist version of Marxism could find, quote, some textual justification, end quote, in the works of Marx and Engels. As Stoyanovich pointed out, the fact of the matter is that the, quote, economistic scheme was attributed to Marx and Engels not without some justification. It is present in their writings, end quote. Stoyanovich, 1981. Furthermore, Markovich contended that Engels', quote, dialectic of nature was to blame for the method and way of thinking espoused and implemented by the, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, of institutionalized Marxism, while Rubel went to some length to specify Engels' role in the development of the myth about Marx and attributed to Engels, quote, the problematic honor and rank of, quote, founder of Marxism, end quote, as an ideological system. Although even more critical and creative variants of Marxism have fallen prey to the influence of the base superstructure model and the economistic scheme, by and large, one of the key characteristics of the open Marxist tradition's return to a new reading of Marx has been the, quote, explicit repudiation of the schema of base and superstructure and the abandoning of strict historical determinism, end quote. Stoyanovich. A very, very important book, in my opinion, that I think is unduly neglected, is Derek Sayers' book, The Violence of Abstraction. I have it on this channel, the whole thing. I think I have a playlist of it, but you should definitely listen to it because it kind of strictly demolishes this technological determinist Marxism. Also, people that would be important to look at in addition to that, besides just people coming from the open Marxist tradition, I think people coming from the so-called political Marxist tradition, people like Brenner and Ellen Mason's Wood, also criticize technological determinism, and which is basically the core of what the base and superstructure metaphor, in their view, fundamentally reduces to. The other important thing, just within Marx himself, I feel like the most, probably the most damning evidence against viewing Marx strictly in this way is the so-called the missing chapter, the results of the immediate production process as a whole, which is on this channel, which is the crucial text in which the concepts of subsumption, the subsumption of the production process to capital, and how social structure fundamentally dictates the technical composition of the production process in order for capital to remake production in its own image. So I think that's a very, within Marx, I think that's a very important place. And I think you can find that maybe not so clearly stated throughout Capital as well. The nature of competition also, for instance, being like that social relationship being a real determinant of economic development. And furthermore, I think the whole history of the Soviet Union, for example, which nationalized property, where like the state and the economy very much fucking like the distinction between the two in a lot of ways fundamentally vanished. You couldn't just say the economy dictated the political superstructure in that instance. And the same could be said of feudalism. I think Ellen Mason's Wood has done a lot of work. Wrote a big essay. I haven't read it, and I really like to. Her essay, though, is fundamentally about the nature of how capitalism, how the base superstructure, I'm not exactly sure, but one of the key characteristics of capitalism, at least in its very most liberal phases, and I would say perhaps capitalism in general, is the bifurcation of society into the political and economic spheres, or the bifurcation between state and civil society. And in that work, she talks about how like the base superstructure model, if it were, I think she says this, I'm not sure, I might be putting words in her mouth. I think she says like basically that the base superstructure metaphor, if it works at all, and isn't just kind of like an actual blockage to actual empirically Marxist formed social research, is applicable to capitalism in particular, and not to human societies as such, right? I think that's a big aspect of traditional Marxism, is kind of applying specific social content that's specific to capitalism to societies in general. And that's one of the earmarks, I would say, of open Marxism, and a lot of these people that have, I think people have called Karl Korsch, for instance, I don't know if he's been mentioned a couple of times, but like he's being like a radical historicist, right? Really taking seriously capitalism's specificity as an economic system, and not a trans-historical form, and not just a modification of a trans-historical social process. Anyway, but yeah, there's a lot of work that basically the reason I stopped reading was to say, check out that Derek Sayer book, The Violence of Abstraction. Anyway, this has necessarily involved a penetrating critique of the different variants of positivism in tandem with their critique of Althusser's Marxism and structuralism. Congrega, how do you say this person's name? Congrega.
Congrega. Congrega.
Congrega. Congrega, Milan Congrega, summarized this last point succinctly by stating that, quote, positivism may make positivism's appearance as dialectical and historical materialism, diamat, as ... relativism, economism, technocratism, bureaucratism, scientism, and structuralism, ... end quote. Congrega. Let's try that again.
Congrega.
Congrega. With regard to the base and superstructure model, open Marxists sharply criticized the Orthodox Marxist and structuralist idea that the social world is divided into distinct and externally related spheres and structures. By articulating their critical approach, they opposed the segmentation of social reality into various compartments and the primacy of economics as a privileged sphere over the subordinate political, legal, cultural, and ideological spheres. For open Marxism, there is only one world, one social reality, and one of the fundamental weaknesses of closed versions of Marxism is that they reified those dualisms, hierarchies, and divisions as natural foundations of the social order. By doing so, they also tended to naturalize bourgeois social institutions and historically specific social relations. The postulate that everything seems to be defined by the economic structure contains a presupposition, an assumption that leads to an ahistorical and uncritical stance. It does not explain things, phenomena, and structures, but amounts to an abstract theoretical and metaphysical discussion about the level of their mutual interaction, of their, quote, relative autonomy, end quote, and, quote, determination in the last instance, end quote. Economic categories are presupposed and dissociated from the society in which economic categories spring and to which economic categories belong. The reified objectivity of the base superstructure model makes subjectivity, that is, the social practice of the real individuals and class struggles, disappear, whereas the social classes in this economistic and deterministic schema. And what happened to the social relations? Where are the social classes in this economistic and deterministic schema, and what happened to social relations? Quote, is it not a kind of caricature, end quote, of man and human society, asked Petrovich, to regard them as a, quote, mechanical sum, set or combination of mutually independent factors, which maintain external relationships of, quote, determination, quote, action, quote, influence? Is not man something united and integral, which strictly speaking cannot be divided into independent, quote, factors or spheres, end quote? Petrovich. The oversimplistic and vulgarized interpretation of Marxism, which is grounded in the theory of structures and factors, as Petrovich maintained, represents the, quote, immediate factuality, end quote, of class society. By moving, quote, inside the limits of the theory of factors, end quote, this interpretation of Marxism tends to overlook the point that the, quote, society whose outward appearance, end quote, it seeks to exemplify is the, quote, self-alienated, dehumanized society, end quote. Petrovich. The economic, quote, factor, as is the case with the existence and function of other, quote, factors, according to Kosick, is the product of a, quote, definite historical form of development, end quote. In the course of this development, people's creation, products, and social activity become independent and convert into factors. In this form, they, quote, traverse into uncritical consciousness as autonomous forces independent of man and man's activity, end quote. Kosick. Seeking to supply a materialist interpretation of the prevalent role of the economic factor in Orthodox Marxism and structuralism, Kosick argued that this approach is based on a fetishist perception of capitalist reality because it turns the movement of social development upside down. It regards reified social relations as, quote, agents of, quote, social development, though in reality, the only agent of social movement is man himself, in the process of producing and reproducing his social life, end quote. Petrovich. By understanding society as an aggregate of interactive and mutually influenced structures, structuralism takes society to be a closed system in which the, quote, subject vanishes, end quote, and more importantly is replaced by a, quote, subject that has been mythologized, reified, and fetishized by the autonomous movement of structures, end quote. As a result, the structuralist conception of society suffers from, quote, sociologism, end quote, because in their understanding of the various social phenomena, society enters into them, quote, only from without, as social determinism, end quote. Since society, quote, is not intrinsic, end quote, to these phenomena, quote, subjectively as the social man who is its creator, end quote. What is more, by ascribing a privileged role to the economic factor and by focusing on the economic factor's interaction with and mutual influence on other factors, the factor theory avoids the, quote, question of how the social whole, i.e. society as an economic formation, originates and is formed, end quote. Kosick. Such an approach and understanding of society, quote, takes its formation for granted as a given fact, as an uninvolved external form or arena in which the one privileged factor determines all the others, end quote. In contradistinction to this approach, Kosick pointed out that critical Marxism, quote, acknowledges no privileged economic factor which would in a decisive manner determine the other parts of factors of society, end quote. And by challenging the traditional approaches, Kosick vehemently argues that, quote, poetry is not a reality of a lower order that is economics, end quote. He argued that, quote, poetry is not a reality of a lower order that is economics, end quote. From the open Marxist perspective, Marxist orthodoxy and structuralism amounted to a total inversion of Marxist critical social theory and critique of political economy. Instead of breaking up the predominance of the economy and severely critiquing the inhumanity of capitalist social relations, which naturalized and advocated the religion of economic determinacy, the dogmatic and established version of Marxism elevated the concept of economic determinacy to a completely methodological canon of historical materialism. The utter simplistic and deterministic conception that pierces the, quote, fetishized fragments of capitalist social relations as its starting point is a conception that is fundamentally uncritical and ahistorical, end quote. As Clark argued, is the, quote, most fundamental characteristic of economism, end quote. Clark. The term, quote, economism, however, does not merely denote that the, quote, economy has a dominant role within the social order, that is rather a restricted understanding of its meaning fostered by Althusserians. For Clark, in the theory and practice of the Orthodox Marxist tradition, the concept of, quote, economism related to the separation of the economic from the political. This separation, which was a key characteristic of Althusserianism, echoed the economism of the Second International, which divorced the economic struggle of the trade unions from the political struggles of the party. Against this background, Stoyanovich noted that, quote, Althusser ... holds the view of Marx that prevailed during the Second International, and even the Third, end quote, embellished by a more sophisticated and newfangled conceptual framework. This separation of the economic and political was based on a, quote, particular technicist conception of the economy, which saw no need to contest the domination of capital at the point of production, and no continuity between, quote, economic and, quote, political struggle, end quote. Clark. From this standpoint, the social struggles of the exploited and oppressed classes are disregarded. From this standpoint, the social struggles of the exploited and oppressed class are disregarded and seen as playing no role in the making of history. The creative agency, conditions, and possibilities of the people were disallowed and repudiated, and human beings as a social subject were reduced to a, quote, mere personification of structural properties, end quote. Conversely, in this inversion, capital and structures become the subject of social development. By assuming the dominant and primary role of capital, structural approaches presuppose structures as, quote, as always already existing extra-mundane things, end quote. And then they, quote, analyze their functional requirements of reproduction, end quote, by arguing that, quote, human social practice unfolds within a framework established by objective laws, end quote. Bonafelt and Psychopetus, 2005. One of the key aspects of Althusser's polemics against, quote, historicism, according to Clark, was his endeavor to evince the, quote, autonomy of the theory, the, quote, autonomy of theory, end quote, and establish the, quote, authority of the theorist, end quote. The autonomy that was assigned to theory was based on Althusser's espousal of a, quote, bourgeois ideological conception of society, end quote, and Althusser's objective to lay the foundations of the, quote, autonomy and authority of mental over manual relations, end quote. Acting as a mechanical materialist, this separation of mental from manual labor was confusingly and misleadingly attributed by Althusser to the technical conditions of production and the requirements of a technical division of labor, instead of conceiving it as the product of the historical and social, quote, domination of capital over labor and the associated appropriation of the creative powers of labor by capital, end quote. Clark. I'm going to reread that because there's a lot of those in italics. Acting as a mechanical materialist, this separation of mental and manual labor was confusingly and misleadingly attributed by Althusser to the technical conditions of production and the requirements for a technical division of labor, instead of conceiving it as a product of the historical and social, quote, domination of capital over labor and the associated appropriation of the creative powers of labor by capital, end quote. From this perspective, the unequal relationship between mental and manual labor, which has been one of the key and peculiar characteristics of capitalist production relations, is deemed to be established as a social necessity and an integral part of the preservation and quote, eternization, end quote, of bourgeois relations. This insight is a deeply embedded element of a, quote, ideology because it postulates as eternal that which is historically specific, end quote. And it is therefore a, quote, bourgeois ideology because what it postulates as eternal is the bourgeois production relation, end quote. What is more, this perception has served to, quote, justify the subordination of labor to capital in bourgeois society, to the reformer in utopian socialism, to the party and to the state in Stalinism, end quote. Simon Clark. Part of Althusser's distinctive and misleading interpretation of Marx was his separation of, quote, ideology from, quote, science, according to which ideological beliefs and concepts are adequate and appropriate in ideological struggles but must be obliterated and eliminated from science. As Kolakowski pointed out, by treating Marxism as, quote, science, Althusser countered the idea of Marxist and critical theory being an expression of the real historical movement, the actual historical process and spontaneity of working class struggles. Althusser firmly believed, as did Kautsky and Lenin, that Marxism as science, quote, had to be imported from outside by intellectuals into the workers' movement, end quote. Althusser. In 1963, this led Althusser to participate in a, quote, direct political intervention, end quote, in the best interest of the French Communist Party, quote, attacking in a sense student movement for its challenge to the integrity of science, end quote. Clark. This polemic against the emerging student movement had considerable implications for its later advancement of the, quote, creation of a, quote, authoritarian left, end quote, current which stood above the revolt of the student and youth workers, end quote. Unsurprisingly, the anti-capitalist and anti-authoritarian youth movements of the 1960s acted as a political and practical critique of the institutionalized and Althusserian structuralist versions of Marxism. They challenged the traditional version of structuralism and historical materialism as legitimating factors of both the Stalinist regimes and the centralized party-like organizations of the traditional labor movement. Just as a side note, I don't know, I feel like sometimes with people, there's an attempt to kind of reduce 1968 and the student movements of the 1960s to its to its anti-authoritarian phase. But definitely, and this is something that's difficult, right? Because like Althusser is putting forward like a dogmatic, it's kind of like breathing new life into dogmatic Marxism, Orthodox Marxism. But one of the things that's important is that at the same time there was like another kind of Stalinism that gained prevalence among the youth movement in the form of Maoism, which I don't know if Memos is going to talk about Maoism, but it's extremely important because the Maoists didn't really, to my understanding at least, I'm not a super expert, but they were like ultra voluntarist, right? They didn't really have, like, it was kind of anti-intellectual and kind of like viewed that like the main revolutionary spring came from appropriate utilization of will, right? And so a lot of the Stalinists, like within the student movement, who came to prevalence, didn't have like they had their Stalinism was not of a kind of like conservative kind of dogmatic type, but kind of like an ultra voluntarist, like fanatical populist type, which did come to actually have an important which did come to have life within the student movement itself, right? So there's kind of like this kind of historiography, or like not historiography, but just kind of like this general thrust. And maybe Memos, I'm not saying Memos believes this, but like there's this kind of general thing where it's like the students versus the Stalinists, and that's too simple. It might be better to say the students versus one type of Stalinist versus, but within the students there was the libertarian wing, right? The situationist perhaps inspired wing, maybe the Frankfurt School inspired wing in Germany, and then there was the kind of like Che Guevara, Mao Zedong, PLO kind of wing within the student movement itself. So there's kind of like, just to complicate this kind of story a little bit, and not to say this doesn't make anything that Memos is saying wrong by any means, but it's just like a thought that came to my mind. There's a very good article on this channel by Christos Memos, which is a review of a book by a guy, I think his name is Jens Benecke, which is a kind of a review of the authoritarian degeneration of the student movement. Also, any of the things from Lauren Goldner about Maoism in the United States talks about this same kind of thing, particularly the one that's a review of Max Elbaum's, I think that's how you say his name, Revolution in the Air, which is basically a critique of the Stalinist wing of the student movement, represented by the influence of like the Progressive Labor Party, which is like the big Maoist party, at least in the United States. So yeah, check out some of those things. Also check out, this is not directly related to, I think I have, well, not directly related to Maoism in the Western student movement, but check out the pieces by Simon Lay. I haven't finished this book on this channel, or Simon Lays, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, from France, who wrote a book called The Chairman's New Clothes. I think that's his title. I haven't looked at the book in a while. But he basically, there's definitely an influence of like there's definitely like a certain interpretation amongst the students of what the so-called proletarian cultural revolution in China was about. And Simon Lay like wrote a book called The Chairman's New Clothes, which kind of like broke that myth. The idea that it was like kind of something like, it was something akin to like I think there was this general idea that it was something akin to the Chinese Hungary 1956 or the Prague Spring or something like that, even though the Prague Spring came later. But this is the idea that it was something akin to that, and that was fundamentally not what its impetus was. Obviously, there was people who within the Cultural Revolution who did use it to utilize like what you might call like anti-bureaucratic, direct democratic demands. I think there was like a thing called like the Shanghai Commune. I think that's where it was. I don't know. I can't remember exactly. But basically, yeah, check that out. But just note the idea that there was this libertarian youth movement that was just libertarian, and then there was this this stale, ossified, out of touch French Communist Party. There's a little more complication that could be said about it, but you know, it's just That's not what this chapter's about. It's about theory. They challenge the traditional versions of structuralism and historical materialism as legitimating factors of both the Stalinist regimes and the centralized party-like organizations of the traditional labor movement. Let me repeat that. Unsurprisingly, the anti-capitalist and anti-authoritarian youth movements of the 1960s acted as a practical critique of the institutionalized and Althusserian structuralist versions of Marxism. They challenged the traditional versions of structuralism and historical materialism as legitimating factors of both the Stalinist regimes and the centralized party-like organizations of the traditional labor movement. The motto on the Sorbonne walls during the general strike of 1968, quote, Althusser à rien, a play on words that means, quote, Althusser, you are useless, end quote, reveals the movement's attitude towards the structuralist theses and strict historical determinism. As Castoriadis noted in relation to his critique of Althusser in the May 1968 events, quote, while a new contestation was developing, while people were searching for and beginning to create new attitudes, norms, values, the accent was placed on, quote, structures so as to evacuate living history, end quote. Castoriadis. There's another side note. One of the people that is probably helpful in looking at this is a guy, he's like a historian of like the 60s. I think he's primarily in Germany, like a historian of the student movement in like the broadest sense, right? Just kind of like, and also like the cultural, the countercultural world of West Germany in the 60s and 70s. And he talks about how he has a thing. He has pieces about like there's kind of like two student movements as well. Check out I think it's Timothy S. Brown on the YouTubes. Yeah. Also, this I think within like Althusser's like own like circle or whatever, there's the so-called like Rancière controversy, right? Rancière was like a student and follower of Althusser, and then broke with him, and I think like went into a direction of like Maoism, right? So this is like kind of like, and it was partially about, and it was at least largely about, I think he had a book called like Althusser's Mistake or something like that. I can't remember what it's precisely called, but Rancière did not go into like a libertarian direction, even though he probably went into like an ultra-voluntarist direction, which is kind of like sometimes collapsed into a libertarian position because it's so, because it's like chaotic or something like that, or like, I don't know, fire in your belly voluntarist kind of shit. But he, within the movement, is like there was the movement was not from stale Stalinist dogma to some kind of anarchist kind of position. It was, or a councilist position, but towards a but towards like a voluntarist Stalinism, which is, I think you could definitely say is what it's kind of like a short, brief summary of Maoism. Where am I? As Castoriadis noted in relation to his critique of Althusser in the May 1968 events, quote, while a new contestation was developing, while people were searching for and beginning to create new attitudes, norms, values, the accent was placed on, quote, structures, so as to evacuate living history, end quote. As a result, structuralism was not merely questioned and challenged during the May Revolt, it, quote, melted away, end quote. As, quote, living history came to evacuate structuralism, end quote. Castoriadis. In addition, Althusser's work highlighted the idea of the, quote, epistemological break, end quote, in the works of Marx, and the publication of theses on Feuerbach and the German ideology. According to structuralist interpretations of Marx's writings, this rupture constituted a discontinuity in Marxist thought and a turning point, which separated the, quote, young, quote, ideological, and, quote, humanist Marx from the, quote, mature and, quote, scientific Marx. Arguably, the, quote, base superstructure and, quote, model, and Althusser's structuralist positions concerning the, quote, epistemological break, and, quote, and the opposition between the, quote, young and the, quote, old Marx, or Marx's method, in the meaning of dialectic and Engels', quote, dialectics of nature, gave rise to much controversy between the orthodox and critical Marxist trends, and set the agenda for endless debates and confrontations in which diametrically opposed views were expressed. According to Clark, Althusser sought to, quote, perpetuate communist orthodoxy, unquote, by stating the foundations for a, quote, new orthodoxy in the interpretation of Marx, unquote. Simon Clark. In the same vein, Kolakowski opined that Althusser's views resembled a, quote, gratuitous ideological project intended to preserve a certain traditional model of Marxism typical of Stalinist communism, end quote. Kolakowski, 1971. Kolakowski maintained that Althusser's theory was formulated in, quote, extremely pretentious language, and, quote, consisted of, quote, common sense banalities expressed with the help of unnecessarily complicated neologisms, and, quote, replicated traditional Marxist concepts and ideas, which in all their fuzziness, ambiguity, and obscurity replicated inter alia Engels' position on the, quote, relative autonomy, end quote, of the superstructure with regard to the economic base. The vagueness also applied to Althusser's use of terms such as, quote, ideology, quote, humanism, and, quote, historicism. One of the key weaknesses of Althusser's analysis is related to the fact that the version of Marxism he is endeavoring to supply maintains a, quote, bourgeois conception of production, end quote, according to which the capitalist production relations are treated as technical relations. By conceiving of the production process as an essentially technical process, Althusser separated production from the, quote, ideological and, quote, political, and by doing so he not only treated the capitalist production relations as eternal, but also unable to provide a critique of the forms of appearance. See Clark, 1980. I feel like I don't know if I said this already, but I have a couple pieces by Althusser from the book Reading Capital on this channel. I feel like I had another thought there. There's a book on this channel titled, I don't know, it's just the critique of technology, or like towards a critique of technology, edited by a guy named Phil Slater. But it has pieces by, I can't remember what her name was, Monica something, but it also has a piece by Raniero Pansieri. But I would say that it was following Lenin and Trotsky and just Bolshevism in general. There was an extremely uncritical view of production despotism, I would say, right? Their main idea, especially if you think of like the pounding on the table about the importance of one-man management and like discipline and subordination to one-man management in the factory. That I think that was kind of just like the kind of like taken for granted neutrality of production, right? Obviously, they critiqued unequal distribution, right? They critiqued the private ownership of production. They critiqued inequality in consumption, right? Or at least to an extent. They always viewed inequality as a necessary incentive to boost production in Russia, where they were basically, by many accounts, basically building capitalism in a Russia that did not have a capitalism beforehand, right? There's actually a good quote by, I don't know if it originally came from Bordiga, but it was put by Jacques Camat. Socialism is not built, which I think is fascinating. That is one of the most insightful statements, I think, about the nature of socialist transformation, right? And that was kind of like what the Bolsheviks did, right? They kind of They, I think you could say either. I think you could say they were building a form of capitalism. They were developing the productive force, and that was the priority for them, was developing the productive forces. And the productivism had the political consequences of like subordinating all of the humanistic values of Marxism, what you might call the warm stream of Marxism, to the cold stream of Marxism, which is using this Ernst Bloch term of developing the productive forces, right? But they never had any kind of critique, really, any substantial critique of authoritarianism within production. Like, it's just not there. In fact, they favored it. I think they draw, for instance, on that one piece by Engels on authority or whatever, as opposed to looking at the broader overview of Marx's work, which frequently emphasizes the despotism of the capitalist production process and is critical towards the production process. They were not. They fully viewed this as neutral. But anyway, this book by Phil Slater has an edited volume called Towards a Critique of Technology, has a bunch of essays which basically, in their own different ways, point to like the social, the way that capital, just like when I was talking about earlier about the immediate results of the immediate production, the immediate results of the production process, talk about the way that capital subsumes technology, right? How it reorganizes production in the favor of increased production of surplus value, right? How it's not what they create within production with its is not just a kind of like developing a neutral technical base whose fruits are just unequally distributed. They're talking about how capitalist production, how technique is in fact itself social, and social in the sense of like not just cooperation, neutral cooperation, but in the sense of domination. It seems like a lot of those things now, where it seems like pretty banal facts, but I think for the longest time within just general mainstream Marxism, that critique of like production itself, the critique of production, was something that was excluded to a very small amount of people. Obviously, anarchists would always have an opinion about hierarchy and stuff just because they critique hierarchy in general, but within the Marxist camp, the relations of production within the factory and like the critique of hierarchy within hierarchy and subordination and domination within production was not something that was particularly emphasized. What was emphasized was inequality at the end of the day, after the production process was over. The unequal distribution of value, basically. But one of the other things that I was thinking of now that is important is that there's a piece on this channel by Paresh Chattopadhyay that talks about Marxism and bureaucracy, which is a fascinating piece, which is talks about how within Marx had a whole theory of economic bureaucratism, right? Whereas if you read Trotsky, when he's talking about bureaucracy, he's not talking about bureaucracy and production, which he takes as neutral, right? And he doesn't think that a cast of managers dictating and controlling production and telling the direct being completely authoritarian to the direct producers. He did not think that was anything particularly socially specific. But in this piece by Chattopadhyay, he talks about how Marx talked about bureaucratization with an economic bureaucratization within the capitalist firm, right? Which obviously people like Castoriadis and I'll talk about too. But I think he kind of, I mean, I can't remember the finer details of the essay, but he makes the point that this kind of like critique of bureaucratism within production was made by Marx, but is kind of lost by subsequent Marxists who kind of like it's being said here, take technology, take the production process in and of itself and the hierarchies that existed in it as legitimate, or takes the processes of production just like for granted, and really only critiques ownership and distribution. That I think I lost my thought, but basically, like that was the main critique of capitalism, critique of production itself, the relations of the production relationships in the immediate site of production were something that were kind of like not really taken into too much consideration. So when people like Castoriadis and C.L.R. James and Raya Dunayevskaya took up these questions, they were doing something very radical within the Marxist tradition that really wasn't much done before. Anyway, sorry about that. By conceiving of the production process as an essentially technical process, Althusser separated production from the quote ideological and quote political, and by doing so, Althusser not only treated the capitalist production relations as eternal, but also unable to provide a critique of the forms of appearance. On the contrary, Althusser made the appearances the measure of capitalist social reality, and abandoned the law of value. Since Althusser considered Marx's theory of commodity fetishism to be, quote, ideological. However, according to Clark, it is the theory of commodity fetishism that could enable us to, quote, penetrate the ideological, quote, humanism-economism couple, end quote, and to criticize it by transforming our conception of social relations, and not by simply rearranging them into a new type of whole, end quote. That's probably why, as Bonafelt added, quote, Althusser's recommendation to, quote, to skip, end quote, the fetishism of commodities section in Capital, quote, recognizes its challenge to the structuralist account, end quote. Within early humanist and more critical Marxist circles, the engagement with Marx's, quote, early writings was in accordance with the post-war intellectual and political milieu, where Marxist humanism was seen, understood, and used as an ally in the fight against the experienced forms of barbarism expressed by fascism and Stalinism. At times, however, Marxist and progressive scholars and a number of existential philosophers, some even coming from a Jesuit Catholic background, exclusively associated and in many cases totally identified with the early humanist theory of alienation as articulated in the, quote, Young Marx. More specifically, Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 were treated as a complete and absolute point of departure in order to defend, reinterpret, and restore the philosophical and humanist character of Marxist theorizing. This part of Marx's writings and the ensuing specific themes of investigation were backed up by obstinate adherence to and evocation and application of a selective philosophical terminology. It was assigned a merit that not only tended to overshadow Marx's later works and the totality of Marx's theoretical production, but also occasionally took up the form of a complete, fixed and closed system of thought. Thus, unintentionally or without realizing or being fully aware of the outcome of their intellectual endeavor, they ended up producing a new conformism and canonization of Marx's thought, thus establishing a new, quote, paradigm and, quote, closed system of what supposedly constitutes the essence and crux of Marx's work. The new canonization of Marxist thought displayed once again all the traits of doctrinaire scholasticism by resorting to a pedantic engagement with the young Marxist quotations in order to prove that another, much better and more human Marx did really exist. It also resulted in a further ideologization, reification, mythification, and simplification of Marxism, and in many cases it also engendered an abstract and sentimental humanism. A new jargon and stereotyped phraseology that related to the writings of the young Marx was reproduced, and a new kind of orthodoxy was reintroduced through the back door. A similar preoccupation with the above issues runs through and within the open Marxist tradition. Far from being a homogeneous group of critical scholars, there have been cases in the various forms of open Marxism in France and Eastern Europe where Marx's, quote, early writings were used as an antidote to the Stalinist dialectic of materialism, end quote, and utilized as a reaction to Stalinist dogmatism and positivism. Axelos's analysis of Marx's thought, for instance, particularly his exposition and interpretation of Marx's concept of alienation, is almost exclusively concerned with Marx's early writings and principally with the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. He pays far less attention to the study of capital. The book. Axelos based his interpretation of Marx on the Paris manuscripts of 1844, since the Paris manuscripts of 1844 contain the, quote, central point of Marxian thought, retaining a, quote, place of absolute centrality, end quote, and being, quote, the richest in ideas of all Marxian and Marxist writings, end quote. Reproducing a particular and exclusive interpretation of Marxist thought, which was based utterly on Marx's, quote, young period, and early writings turned out to be ill-advised and eventually misleading and obscure. Although Gayo Petrovich noted that, quote, without the, quote, young Marx, a full understanding of the, quote, old is impossible, end quote, Gayo Petrovich vehemently and aptly argued that the argument that the, quote, real Marx could be found in the, quote, young Marx is a reaction against and, quote, negation of Stalinism that makes concessions to Stalinism, end quote. In a manner similar to Orthodox and structuralist Marxists, this thesis accepted and reproduced the subsistence and opposition between the, quote, two Marxes, and at the same time, quote, magnanimously surrendered the, quote, old Marx to the Stalinists, end quote. Despite the disparities these kinds of approaches had as a common denominator the view expressed by Fetcher, one of the key participants in the Praxis Summer School and Corcula, that Marx's, quote, later writings can only be adequately understood in the light of his first writings, end quote. On the other hand, Schmidt conceptualized the second approach articulated in part of the open Marxist tradition by arguing that the critical content and significance of Marx's work was largely located in Marx's later writings and more specifically in Das Kapital. Quote, the early writings of Marx and Engels, which for a long time were considered to contain the Marxist philosophico-humanist content proper, can only be fully understood by a historico-economic analysis of Das Kapital. This is, above all, true of historical materialism, end quote. Alfred Schmidt. By starting with Marx's mature writings, we can make sense of and interpret his early writings, and this corresponds to Marx's method and his point that we can only explicate and illuminate the anatomy of the ape if we begin our analysis and comprehension with man's anatomy. In line with Schmidt's argument, Bonafelt argued that the Marx of Capital sheds light on the Marx of economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. Bonafelt considers Althusser's critique of the young Marx as, quote, abstract humanism, end quote, as sound and valid. However, contrary to Althusser, he pointed out that the later Marx, the Marx of the critique of political and bourgeois economic categories, is the, quote, humanist Marx because his critique of capitalist society seeks to decipher the actual relations of life in their inverted form of economic things, end quote. In defense of the philosophical character of Marx's writings and in search for the relationship between philosophy and economy in his work, Kosick also remarked that the reading and interpretation of Marx's manuscripts of 1844, quote, in isolation from Marx's total development, end quote, is, quote, one of the reasons for the repetitiveness, ennui, and superficiality of dozens of essays entitled, quote, The Young Marx, end quote, end quote. Kosick. As Bonafelt aptly wrote, quote, the discussion about an early philosophical Marx and a matured scientific Marx is tiresome and fruitless, end quote. Bonafelt. Worse still, the plethora of tedious and doctrinary analyses and publications and the proliferation of scholasticism concerning Althusser's position on the, quote, young and the, quote, old Marx are, according to Kolakowski, typical, not merely of ideological thinking, but also exemplify a characteristic feature of religious thinking akin to the theologians who seek to establish and clarify the relationship between the Old and New Testament. Certainly, these kinds of juxtapositions were necessitated by and derived from certain political and historical conditions, as well as the imperative need to counter the myths, illusions, and gross misinterpretations of Marx's work generated by the closed and institutionalized versions of Marxism. However, no matter how great an effort the open Marxists made to use the critique of the dogmatic versions of Marxism as a starting point for rereading, rethinking, and renewing Marxism, it is undoubtedly true that some aspects of open Marxist engagement did not manage to escape from this kind of theological thinking that Kolakowski refers to. However, in general, their, quote, return to Marx, and, quote, did not aim at a, quote, detailed comparison of quotations, and, quote, from Marx's writings. Quote, quotations, as Petrovich aptly wrote, quote, can be very deceptive, end quote. With this in mind, and despite the fact that at times open Marxists remained caught in this kind of comparison and juxtaposition of Marx's quotations, they were clear that a, quote, truly creative return to his opus must be selective and critical, end quote. Stoyanovich. Despite their heterogeneity and their historical, political, and theoretical differentiations, the open Marxist critical scholars are united by a common approach which is based on specific shared elements. First, by and large, they examined Marx's work in its entirety. By grasping and interpreting the meaning of Marx's theorizing as a whole, they understood both his early and late writings as parts of the whole theoretical edifice. In doing so, it can be argued that they uncovered a, quote, young, quote, new Marx in the, quote, mature Marx, while simultaneously using Marx's early critique of the bourgeois state and law to enrich his critique of political economy seen as a critical social theory. Open Marxists thus argued for a theoretical continuity between Marx's early work and later writings, and they acknowledged that there is an inherent unity in Marx's work. They did not construct a boundary between Marx's youthful and Marx's mature work, but they considered the evolution of Marx's theorizing from a unified point of view. In contrast to Althusser, Axelos emphasized that Marxist thought evolved. It had to be seen as a unitary process, as, quote, there are not two Marxes, the early and the late, the youthful and the mature, end quote, but rather, quote, two periods integrally bound together, end quote. Axelos. In the same vein, Petrovich emphasized the, quote, continuity of Marxist thought, end quote, and noted that, quote, there are not two fundamentally different and mutually unconnected Marxes, end quote. Petrovich. Marx's thinking was continuously changing and developing, but, quote, there were no such turns in this process as would represent a complete break with former ideas and the passage to entirely different or even opposite conceptions, end quote. Petrovich. As Clark aptly pointed out, quote, Marx's work did not emerge on the basis of epistemological breaks with a closed system of concepts inherited from classical political economy. Marx's work emerged precisely out of an attempt to develop and to deepen the insights achieved by the working class in Britain, France, and Germany, end quote. Marx did not abandon the idea articulated in his early writings. Marx further expanded and developed them in later writings. What that claim implied was that, quote, only when, bracket, Marx's work, in bracket, is considered as a whole can it serve as an adequate theoretical basis of the revolutionary struggle, end quote. Petrovich. The interpretation that encompasses Marx's writing as a whole, however, does not lead open Marxists to ignore the diversity, contradictions, complexities, shortcomings, errors, and limitations of Marxist thought. Open Marxists recognize that in addition to the misconception of the existence of two entirely different Marxes, there is also the, quote, danger of constructing a monolithic mythology of Marx, end quote. Stoyanovich. 1981. Their approach would indicate that there is not a, quote, single Marx, end quote. In Axelos's view, quote, one cannot propose a one-dimensional approach in reading of Marx. If someone did so, she would be dogmatic, end quote. Axelos, in Memos, 2009. Open Marxism does not propose a complete definitive interpretation of Marx. Rather, open Marxism aims to open up a space for a theoretical and practical critique that understands progress as a, quote, movement from reification towards emancipation, end quote. Markovich. Conceived as a unified process, Marxist thought and its development entailed neither grasping it as a, quote, all-embracing and finished system, end quote, nor understanding it as a, quote, eternal truth for all time, end quote. Rather, Marx's work is, quote, full of open problems. Marx's work contains questions without answers, searches without final results, end quote. As Petrovich noted, quote, what was merely a question for Marx cannot be a ready answer for us, end quote. And conversely, quote, what Marx himself regarded as a solution may become a problem for us, end quote. Marx's work does not provide ready-made solutions, nor supply us with the ideal model for a future society. Instead, he provides us with a model at all. It is a model of and for critical thinking. Equally important, as Fetcher reminded us, is the fact that what remains distinctive about both Marx's early and later writings is, quote, one fundamental topic, which is the starting as well as the ending point, the quest to transcend capitalist society towards a more human, free, and satisfactory society, end quote. Fetcher. To achieve this critique and transcendence of capitalist society, a return to and reinterpretation of Marxist thought was needed, according to Markovich, quote, in order to restore and to further develop his critical method, end quote. The return to Marx and the further elaboration and expansion of his critical method could only be accomplished by, quote, creative thinking in the spirit of Marx, by co-thinking with Marx, and by thinking through Marx's guiding ideas, end quote. Petrovich. Rereading Marx without searching for a new dogma or banalities, cliches, and convenient ready-made truths, one learns, according to Castoriadis, quote, what it means to think. Quote, what it means to think. One discovers new ways of thinking and of criticizing thought, end quote. Or more importantly, of criticizing, decoding, and demystifying social reality in order to radically transform social reality. That's the end of Chapter 2 of Open Marxism, Critical Theory as Militant Enlightenment by Christos Memos. Chapter 2 was titled, quote, Marx was not an orthodox Marxist, end quote, the critique of institutional Marxism. Thank you for listening, and thank you for letting me mumble out my thoughts in the way that I did. I appreciate it. Thank you.